Jane Austen by Anne Thackeray Ritchie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jane Austen, 1775 to 1817. À mesure qu'on a plus d'esprit, on trouve qu'il y a plus des hommes originaux. Les gens du commun ne trouvaient pas la différence entre des hommes. Pascal. Part 1. I did not know that you were a studier of character, says Bingley to Elizabeth. It must be an amusing study. Yes, but intricate characters are the most amusing. They have at least that advantage. The country, said Darcy, can in general supply but few subjects for such a study. In a country neighbourhood you move in a very confined and unvarying society. But people themselves alter so much, Elizabeth answers, that there is something new to be observed in them for ever. Yes, indeed, cried Mrs. Bennet, offended by Darcy's manner of mentioning a country neighbourhood. I assure you that we have quite as much of that going on in the country as in town. Everybody was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at her for a moment, turned silently away. Mrs. Bennet, who fancied she had gained a complete victory over him, continued her triumph. These people belong to a whole world of familiar acquaintances, who are, notwithstanding their old-fashioned dresses and quaint expressions, more alive to us than a great many of the people among whom we live. We know so much more about them to begin with. Notwithstanding a certain reticence and self-control which seems to belong to their age, and with all their quaint dresses and ceremonies and manners, the ladies and gentlemen in Pride and Prejudice and its companion novels seem like living people out of our own acquaintance, transported bodily into a bygone age, represented in the half-dozen books that contain Jane Austen's works. Dear books! Bright, sparkling with wit and animation, in which the homely heroines charm, the dull hours fly, and the very bores are enchanting. Could we but study our own bores, as Miss Austen must have studied hers in her country village, what a delightful world this might be! A world of Norris's economical great walkers, with dining-room tables to dispose of Lady Bertrams on sofas, with their placid, "Do not act anything improper, my dears." Sir Thomas would not like it. Of Bennets, Goddards, Bateses, of Mr. Collinses, of Rushbrooks, with 42 speeches apiece. A world of Mrs. Eltons, inimitable woman. She must be alive at this very moment, if we but knew where to find her. Her basket on her arm, her nods and all-importance, with Maple Grove and the Sucklings in the background. She would be much excited were she aware how she is esteemed by a late Chancellor of the Exchequer, who is well acquainted with Maple Grove, and Selina too. It might console her for Mr. Knightley's shabby marriage. All these people nearly start out of the pages, so natural and unaffected are they, and yet they never lived except in the imagination of one lady with bright eyes, who sat down some 70 years ago to an old mahogany desk in a quiet country parlour, and evoked them for us. One seems to see the picture of the unknown friend who has charmed us so long, charmed away dull hours, created neighbours and companions for us in lonely places, conferring happiness and harmless mirth upon generations to come. One can picture her as she sits erect, with her long and graceful figure, her full round face, her bright eyes cast down. Jane Austen, the woman of whom England is justly proud, whose method generous Macaulay has placed near Shakespeare. She is writing in secret, putting away her work when visitors come in, unconscious, modest, hidden at home in heart, as she was in her sweet and womanly life, with the wisdom of the serpent indeed, and the harmlessness of a dove. Someone said just now that many people seem to be so proud of seeing a joke at all that they impress it upon you until you are perfectly wearied by it. Jane Austen was not of these. Her humour flows gentle and spontaneous. It is no elaborate mechanism nor artificial fountain, but a bright natural stream, rippling and trickling over every stone and sparkling in the sunshine. We should be surprised nowadays to hear a young lady announce herself as a studier of character. From her quiet home in the country lane, this one reads to us a real page from the absorbing, pathetic, humorous book of human nature, a book that we can most of us understand when it is translated into plain English, but of which the quaint and illegible characters are often difficult to decipher for ourselves. It is a study which, with all respect for Darcy's opinion, must require something of country-like calm and concentration and freedom of mind. It is difficult, for instance, for a too impulsive student not to attribute something of his own moods to his specimens, instead of dispassionately contemplating them from a critical distance. Besides the natural fun and wit and life of her characters, all perfectly discriminated, as Macaulay says, Jane Austen has the gift of telling a story in a way that has never been surpassed. She rules her places, times, characters, and marshals them with unerring precision. In her special gift for organisation, she seems almost unequalled. Her picnics are models for all future and past picnics. Her combinations of feelings, of conversation, of gentlemen and ladies are so natural and lifelike that reading to criticise is impossible to some of us. The scene carries us away, and we forget to look for the art by which it is recorded. Her machinery is simple but complete. Events group themselves so vividly and naturally in her mind that, in describing imaginary scenes, we seem not only to read them, but to live them, to see the people coming and going, the gentlemen courteous and in top boots, the ladies demure and piquant. We can almost hear them talking to one another. No retrospects, no abrupt flights. As in real life, days and events follow one another. Last Tuesday does not suddenly start into existence all out of place, nor does 1790 appear on the scene when we are all well on in 21. Countries and continents do not fly from hero to hero, nor do long and divergent adventures happen to unimportant members of the company. With Jane Austen, days, hours, minutes succeed each other like clockwork. One central figure is always present on the scene. That figure is always prepared for company. Miss Edwards's curl papers are almost the only approach to déshabillé in her stories. There are post-chaises in readiness to convey the characters from Bath or Lyme to Uppercross to Fullerton, from Gracechurch Street to Meryton, as their business takes them. Mr. Knightley rides from Brunswick Square to Hartfield, by a road that Miss Austen herself must have travelled in the curricle with her brother, driving to London on a summer's day. It was a wet ride for Mr. Knightley, followed by that never-to-be-forgotten afternoon in the shrubbery, when the wind had changed into a softer quarter. The clouds were carried off, and Emma, walking in the sunshine, with spirits freshened and thoughts a little relieved, and thinking of Mr. Knightley as 16 miles away, meets him at the garden door, and everybody, I think, must be the happier for the happiness and certainty that 1/2 hour gave to Emma and her indifferent lover. There is a little extract from one of Miss Austen's letters to a niece, which shows that all this successful organisation was not brought about by chance alone, but came from careful workmanship. Your Aunt C, she says, does not like desultory novels, and is rather fearful that yours will be too much so, that there will be too frequent a change from one set of people to another, and that circumstances will be sometimes introduced of apparent consequence, which will lead to nothing. It will not be so great an objection to me. I allow much more latitude than she does, and think nature and spirit cover many sins of a wandering story. But though the sins of a wandering story may be covered, The virtues of a well-told one make themselves felt unconsciously, and without any effort. Some books and people are delightful. We can scarce tell why. They are not so clever as others that weary and fatigue us. It is a certain effort to read a story, however touching, that is disconnected and badly related. It is like an ill-drawn picture, of which the colouring is good. Jane Austen possesses both gifts of colour and of drawing. She could see human nature as it was, with near-sighted eyes, it is true, but having seen, she could combine her picture by her art, and colour it from life. How delightful the people are who play at cards, and pay their addresses to one another, and sup, and discuss each other's affairs. Take Mr. Bennet's reception of his sons-in-law. Take Sir Walter Elliot compassionating the navy and Admiral Baldwin. 9 grey hairs of a side, and nothing but a dab of powder at top. A wretched example of what a seafaring life can do, for men who are exposed to every climate and weather until they are not fit to be seen. It is a pity they are not knocked on the head at once, before they reach Admiral Baldwin's age. Or shall we quote the scene of Fanny Price's return, when she comes to visit her family at Portsmouth, in all daughterly agitation and excitement, and the brothers and fathers and sisters' reception of her? A stare or two at Fanny was all the voluntary notice that her brother bestowed, but he made no objection to her kissing him, though still entirely engaged in detailing further particulars of the thrushes going out of harbour, in which he had a strong right of interest, being about to commence his career of seamanship in her at this very time. After the mother and daughter have received her, Fanny's seafaring father comes in, and does not notice her at first in his excitement. "Captain Walsh thinks you will certainly have a cruise to the westward with the Elephant. By gosh, I wish you may. But old Scholey was saying just now that he thought you would be sent first to the Texel. Well, well, we are ready whatever happens. But by goodness, you lost a fine sight by not being here in the morning to see the thrush go out of harbour. I would not have been out of the way for £1,000. Old Scholey ran in at breakfast time to say she had slipped her moorings and was coming up. I jumped up and made but 2 steps to the platform. If ever there was a perfect beauty afloat, she is one, and there she lies at Spithead, and anybody in England would take her for an 8 and 20. I was upon the platform for 2 hours this afternoon looking at her. She lies close to the Endymion, between her and the Cleopatra, just to the eastward of the sheer hulk." "Ha!" cried William, "that's just where I should have put her myself. It's the best berth in Spithead. But here is my sister, sir. Here is Fanny," turning and leading her forward. "It is so dark you do not see her." With an acknowledgment that he had quite forgot her, Mr. Price now received his daughter, and having given her a cordial hug, and observed that she was growing into a woman, and he supposed would be wanting a husband soon, seemed very much inclined to forget her again. How admirably it is all told, how we hear them all talking. From her own brothers Jane Austen learned her accurate knowledge of ships and seafaring things. From her own observation she must have gathered her delightful droll science of men and women, and their ways and various destinations. Who will not recognise Mrs. Norris in that master touch by which she removes the curtain to save Sir Thomas's feelings, that curtain which had been prepared for the private theatricals he so greatly disapproved of? Mrs. Norris thoughtfully carries it off to her cottage, where she happened to be particularly in want of green baize. Part 2. The charm of friends of pen and ink is their unchangeableness. We go to them when we want them. We know where to seek them. We know what to expect from them. They are never preoccupied. They are always at home. They never turn their backs nor walk away as people do in real life, nor let their houses and leave the neighbourhood, and disappear for weeks together. They are never taken up with strange people, nor suddenly absorbed into some more genteel society, or by some nearer fancy. Even the most volatile among them is to be counted upon. We may have neglected them, and yet when we meet again there are the familiar old friends, and we seem to find our own old selves again in their company. For us, time has, perhaps, passed away, feelings have swept by, leaving interests and recollections in their place, but at all ages there must be days that belong to our youth, hours that will recur so long as men forbear and women remember, and life itself exists. Perhaps the most fashionable marriage on the tapis no longer excites us very much, but the sentiment of an Emma or an Anne Elliot comes home to some of us as vividly as ever. It is something to have such old friends who are so young. An Emma blooming, without a wrinkle or a grey hair, after 20 years' acquaintance. An Elizabeth Bennet, sprightly and charming ever. In the roundabout papers there is a passage about the pen and ink friends my father loved. They used to call the good Sir Walter the Wizard of the North. What if some writer should appear who can write so enchantingly that he shall be able to call into actual life the people whom he invents? What if Mignon and Margaret and Goetz von Berlichingen are alive now, though I don't say they are visible, and Dugald Dalgetty and Ivanhoe were to step in at that open window by the little garden yonder? Suppose Uncas and our noble old leather stocking were to glide in silent. Suppose Athos, Porthos, and Aramis should enter, with a noiseless swagger, curling their moustaches, and dearest Amelia Booth on Uncle Toby's arm, and Tittlebat Titmouse with his hair dyed green, and all the Crumless company of comedians, with the Gil Blas troupe, and Sir Roger de Coverley, and the greatest of all crazy gentlemen, the Knight of La Mancha, with his blessed squire. I say to you, I look rather wistfully towards the window, musing upon these people. Were any of them to enter, I think I would not be very much frightened. Are not such friends as these, and others unnamed here, but who will come unannounced to join the goodly company, creations that, like some people, do actually make part of our existence, and make us the better for theirs? To express some vague feelings is to stamp them. Have we any one of us a friend in a Knight of La Mancha, a Colonel Newcome, a Sir Roger de Coverley? They live for us, even though they may have never lived. They are, and do actually, make part of our lives, one of the best and noblest parts. To love them is like a direct communication with the great and generous minds that conceived them. It is difficult, reading the novels of succeeding generations, to determine how much each book reflects of the time in which it was written. How much of its character depends upon the mind and the mood of the writer. The greatest minds, the most original, have the least stamp of the age, the most of that dominant natural reality which belongs to all great minds. We know how a landscape changes as the day goes on, and how the scene brightens and gains in beauty as the shadows begin to lengthen. The clearest eyes must see by the light of their own hour. Jane Austen's literary hour must have been a midday hour, bright, unsuggestive, with objects standing clear, without much shadow or elaborate artistic effect. Our own age is more essentially an age of strained emotion. Little remains to us of starch, of powder, or courtly reserve. What we have lost in calm, in happiness, in tranquillity, we have gained in emphasis. Our danger is now, not of expressing and feeling too little, but of expressing more than we feel. The living writers of to-day lead us into distant realms and worlds undreamt of in the placid and easily contented Gigot age. Our characters travel by rail and are no longer confined to post-chaises. There is certainly a wide difference between Miss Austen's heroines and, let us say, a Maggie Tulliver. One would be curious to know whether between the human beings who read Jane Austen's books today and those who read them 50 years ago there is as great a contrast. One reason may be, perhaps, that characters in novels are certainly more intimate with us and on less ceremonious terms than in Jane Austen's days, when heroines never gave up a certain gentle self-respect and humour and hardness of heart in which some modern types are a little wanting. Whatever happens, they could for the most part speak of quietly and without bitterness. Love with them does not mean a passion so much as an interest, deep, silent, not quite incompatible with a secondary flirtation. Marianne Dashwood's tears are evidently meant to be dried. Jane Bennet smiles, sighs, and makes excuses for Bingley's neglect. Emma passes one disagreeable morning making up her mind to the unnatural alliance between Mr. Knightley and Harriet Smith. It was the spirit of the age, and, perhaps, one not to be unenvied. It was not that Jane Austen herself was incapable of understanding a deeper feeling. In the last written page of her last written book there is an expression of the deepest and truest experience. Annie Elliot's talk with Captain Benfield is the touching utterance of a good woman's feelings. They are speaking of men and of women's affections. "You're always labouring and toiling," she says, "exposed to every risk and hardship. Your home, country, friends, all united, neither time nor life to be called your own. It would be too hard indeed," with a faltering voice, "if a woman's feelings were to be added to all this." Further on she says eagerly, "I hope I do justice to all that is felt by you and by those who resemble you. God forbid that I should undervalue the warm and faithful feelings of any of my fellow creatures. I should deserve utter contempt if I dared to suppose that true attachment and constancy were known only by woman. No, I believe you capable of everything good and great in your married lives. I believe you equal to every important exertion, and to every domestic forbearance, so long as, if I may be allowed the expression, so long as you have an object. I mean, while the woman you love lives and lives for you. All the privilege I claim for my own sex, it is not a very enviable one, you need not court it, is that of loving longest, when existence or when hope is gone." She could not immediately have uttered another sentence. Her heart was too full, her breath too much oppressed. Dear Anne Elliot, sweet, impulsive, womanly, tender-hearted. One can almost hear her voice pleading the cause of all true women. In those days, when, perhaps, people's nerves were stronger than they are now, sentiment may have existed in a less degree, or have been more ruled by judgment. It may have been calmer and more matter of fact. And yet Jane Austen, at the very end of her life, wrote thus. Her words seem to ring in our ears after they have been spoken. Anne Elliot must have been Jane Austen herself, speaking for the last time. There is something so true, so womanly about her, that it is impossible not to love her most of all. She is the bright-eyed heroine of the earlier novels, matured, softened, cultivated, to whom fidelity has brought only greater depth and sweetness instead of bitterness and pain. What a difficult thing it would be to sit down and try to enumerate the different influences by which our lives have been affected, influences of other lives, of art, of nature, of place and circumstance, of beautiful sights passing before our eyes, of painful ones, seasons following in their course, hills rising on our horizons, scenes of ruin and desolation, crowded thoroughfares, sounds in our ears, jarring or harmonious, the voices of friends, calling, warning, encouraging, of preachers preaching, of people in the street below, complaining and asking our pity. What long processions of human beings are passing before us, what trains of thought go sweeping through our brains. Man seems a strange and ill-kept record of many and bewildering experiences. Look at oneself, not as oneself, but as an abstract human being. One is lost in wonder at the vast complexities which have been brought to bear upon it, lost in wonder and in disappointment perhaps at the discordant result of so great a harmony. Only we know that the whole diapason is beyond our grasp. One man cannot hear the note of the grasshoppers, another is deaf when the cannon sounds. Waiting among these many echoes and mysteries of every kind, and light and darkness and life and death, we seize a note or two of the great symphony and try to sing. And because these notes happen to jar, we think all is discordant hopelessness. Then comes pressing onward in the crowd of life, voices with some of the notes that are wanting to our own part, voices tuned to the same key as our own, or to an accordant one, making harmony for us as they pass us by. Perhaps this is in life the happiest of all experience, and to few of us there exists any more complete ideal. And so, now and then in our lives, when we learn to love a sweet and noble character, we all feel happier and better for the goodness and charity which is not ours, and yet which seems to belong to us while we are near it. Just as some people and states of mind affect us uncomfortably, so we seem to be true to ourselves with a truthful person, generous-minded with a generous nature. Life seems less disappointing and self-seeking when we think of the just and sweet and unselfish spirits, moving untroubled among dinning and distracting influences. These are our friends in the best and noblest sense. We are the happier for their existence. It is so much gain to us. They may have lived at some distant time. We may never have met face to face, or we may have known them and been blessed by their love. But their light shines from afar, their life is for us and with us in its generous example. Their song is for our ears, and we hear it and love it still, though the singer may be lying dead. Part 3. A little book written by one of Jane Austen's nephews tells with a touching directness and simplicity the story of this good and gifted woman, whose name has long been a household word among us, but of whose history nothing was known until this little volume appeared. It is but the story of a country lady, of quiet days following quiet days, of seasons in their course of common events, and yet the history is deeply interesting to those who loved the writer of whom it is written. And as we turn from the story of Jane Austen's life to her books again, we feel more than ever that she, too, was one of those true friends who belong to us inalienably, simple, wise, contented, living in others, one of those whom we seem to have a right to love. Such people belong to all humankind by the very right of their wide and generous sympathies, of their gentle wisdom and lovableness. Jane Austen's life, as it is told by Mr. Austen Leigh, is very touching, sweet and peaceful. It is a country landscape, where the cattle are grazing, the boughs of the great elm tree rocking in the wind. Sometimes, as we read, they come falling with a crash into the sweep. Birds are flying about the old house, homely in its simple rule. The rafters cross the whitewashed ceilings, the beams project into the room below. We can see it all. The parlour with the horsehair sofa, the scant, quaint furniture, the old-fashioned garden outside, with its flowers and vegetables combined, and along the south side of the garden the green terrace sloping away. There is a pretty description of the sisters' devotion to one another. When Cassandra went to school, little Jane accompanied her. The sisters could not be parted. Of the family party, of the old place, where there are hedgerows winding, with green shady footpaths within the copse, where the earliest primroses and hyacinths are found. There is the woodwalk, with its rustic seats, leading to the meadows, the church walk leading to the church, which is far from the hum of the village, and within sight of no habitation except a glimpse of the grey manor house through its circling screen of sycamores. Sweet violets, both purple and white, grow in abundance beneath its south wall. Large elms protrude their rough branches, old hawthorns shed their blossoms over the graves, and the hollow yew tree must be at least coeval with the church. One may read the account of Catherine Morland's home with new interest, from the hint which is given of its likeness to the old house at Steventon, where dwelt the unknown friend whose voice we seem to hear at last, and whose face we seem to recognise, her bright eyes and brown curly hair, her quick and graceful figure. One can picture the children who are playing at the door of the old parsonage and calling for Aunt Jane. One can imagine her pretty ways with them, her sympathy for the active, their games and imaginations. There is Cassandra. She is older than her sister, more critical, more beautiful, more reserved. There is the mother of the family, with her keen wit and clear mind, the handsome father, the handsome proctor, as he was called, the 5 brothers driving up the lane. Tranquil summer passes by, the winter days go by. The young lady still sits writing at the old mahogany desk, and smiling, perhaps, at her own fancies, and hiding them away with her papers at the sound of coming steps. Now the modest papers, printed and reprinted, lie in every hand. The fancies disport themselves at their will in the wisest brains and the most foolish. It must have been at Steventon, Jane Austen's earliest home, that Mr. Collins first made his appearance. Lady Catherine not objecting, as we know, to his occasional absence on a Sunday, provided another clergyman was engaged to do the duty of the day. And here, conversing with Miss Jane, that he must have made many of his profoundest observations upon human nature, remarking, among other things, that resignation is never so perfect as when the blessing denied begins to lose somewhat of its value in our estimation, and propounding his celebrated theory about the usual practice of elegant females. It must have been here, too, that poor Mrs. Bennet declared, with some justice, that once estates are entailed, one can never tell how they will go. Here, too, that Mrs. Allen's sprigged muslin and John Thorpe's rhodomontades were woven, that his gig was built, curricle-hung lamps, seat, trunk, sword-case, splashboard, silver moulding, all, you see, complete. The ironwork as good as new, or better. He asked 50 guineas. I closed with him directly, threw down the money, and the carriage was mine. And I am sure, said Catherine, I know so little of such things that I cannot judge whether it was cheap or dear. Neither the one nor the other, says John Thorpe. Mrs. Palmer was also born at Steventon, that good-humoured lady, in Sense and Sensibility, who thinks it so ridiculous that her husband never hears her when she speaks to him. We are told that Marianne and Eleanor have been supposed to represent Cassandra and Jane Austen, but Mr. Austen Leigh says that he can trace no resemblance. Jane Austen is not 20 when this book is written, and only 21 when Pride and Prejudice is first devised. Cousins presently come on the scene, and amongst them the romantic figure of a young, widowed Comtesse de Feuillade flying from the Revolution to her uncle's home. She is described as a clever and accomplished woman, interested in her young cousins, teaching them French, both Jane and Cassandra knew French, helping in their various schemes, in their theatricals in the barn. She eventually marries her cousin Henry Austen. The simple family annals are not without their romance, but there is a cruel one for poor Cassandra, whose lover dies abroad, and his death saddens the whole family party. Jane, too, receives the addresses (do such things as addresses exist nowadays?) of a gentleman possessed of good character and fortune, and of everything, in short, except the subtle power of touching her heart. One cannot help wondering whether this was a Henry Crawford or an Elton or a Mr. Elliot, or had Jane already seen the person that even Cassandra thought good enough for her sister? Here, too, is another sorrowful story. The sister's fate, there is a sad coincidence and similarity in it, was to be undivided. Their life, their experience was the same. Someone without a name takes leave of Jane one day, promising to come back. He never comes back. Long afterwards they hear of his death. The story seems even sadder than Cassandra's in its silence and uncertainty. For silence and uncertainty are death in life to some people. There is little trace of such a tragedy in Jane Austen's books. Not one morbid word is to be found, not one vain regret. Hers was not a nature to fall crushed by the overthrow of one phase of her manifold life. She seems to have had a natural genius for life, if I may so speak, too vivid and genuinely unselfish to fail her in her need. She could gather every flower, every brightness along her road. Good spirit, content, all the interests of a happy and observant nature were hers. Her gentle humour and wit and interest cannot have failed. It is impossible to calculate the difference of the grasp by which one or another human being realizes existence and the things relating to it, nor how much more vivid life seems to some than to others. Jane Austen, while her existence lasted, realized it, and made the best use of the gifts that were hers. Yet when her life was ending, then it was given to her to understand the change that was at hand. As willingly as she had lived, she died. Some people seem scarcely to rise up to their own work, to their own ideal. Jane Austen's life, as it is told by her nephew, is beyond her work, which only contained one phase of that sweet and wise nature, the creative, observant, outward phase. For her home, for her sister, for her friends, she kept the depth and tenderness of her bright and gentle sympathy. She is described as busy with her neat and clever fingers, sewing for the poor, working fanciful keepsakes for her friends. There is the cup and ball that she never failed to catch. The spillikins lie in every ring where she had thrown them. There are her letters, straightly and neatly folded, and fitting smoothly in their creases. There is something sweet, orderly, and consistent in her character and all her tastes, in her fondness for crab and cowper, in her little joke that she ought to be a Mrs. Crab. She sings of an evening old ballad to old-fashioned tunes with a slow, sweet voice. Further on we have a glimpse of Jane and her sisters in their mob caps, young still, but dressed soberly beyond their years. One can imagine Aunt Jane with her brother's children round her knee, telling her delightful stories or listening to theirs, with never failing sympathy. One can fancy Cassandra, who does not like desultory novels, more prudent and more reserved, and somewhat less of a playfellow, looking down upon the group with elder sister's eyes. Here is an extract from a letter written at Steventon in 1800. I have 2 messages. Let me get rid of them, and then my paper will be my own. Mary fully intended writing by Mr. Charles's Frank, and only happened entirely to forget it, but will write soon, and my father wishes Edward to send him a memorandum of the price of hops. Sunday evening. We have had a dreadful storm of wind in the forepart of the day, which has done a great deal of mischief among our trees. I was sitting alone in the drawing-room when an odd kind of crash startled me. In a moment afterwards it was repeated. I then went to the window. I reached it just in time to see the last of our 2 highly valued elms descend into the sweep. The other, which had fallen, I suppose, in the first crash, and which was nearest to the pond, taking a more easterly direction, sank among our screen of chestnuts and firs, knocking down one spruce fir, breaking off the head of another and stripping the 2 corner chestnuts of several branches in its fall. This is not all. The maple bearing the weathercock was broken in 2, and what I regret more than all the rest is, that all the 3 elms that grew in Hall's meadow, and gave such ornament to it, are gone. A certain Mrs. Stent comes into one of these letters, ejaculating some wonder about the cocks and hens. Mrs. Stent seems to have tried their patience, and will be known henceforward as having bored Jane Austen. They leave Steventon when Jane is about 25 years of age, and go to Bath, from whence a couple of pleasant letters are given us. Jane is writing to her sister. She has visited Miss A., who, like all other young ladies, is considerably genteeler than her parents. She is heartily glad that Cassandra speaks so comfortably of her health and looks. Could travelling 50 miles produce such an immediate change? You were looking poorly when you were here, and everybody seemed sensible of it. Is there any charm in a hack post-chaise? But if there were, Mrs. Craven's carriage might have undone it all. Then Mrs. Stent appears again. Poor Mrs. Stent, it has been her lot to be always in the way, but we must be merciful, for perhaps in time we may come to be Mrs. Stents ourselves, unequal to anything and unwelcome to everybody. Elsewhere she writes, upon Mrs. Somebody's mentioning that she had sent the rejected addresses to Mr. H. I began talking to her a little about them, and expressed my hope of their having amused her. Her answer was, "Oh dear, yes, very much, very droll indeed. The opening of the house and the striking up of the fiddles." What she meant, poor woman, who shall say? But there is no malice in Jane Austen. Hers is the charity of all clear minds. It is only the muddled who are intolerant. All who love Emma and Mr. Knightley must remember the touching little scene in which he reproves her for her thoughtless impatience of poor Miss Bates's volubility. You, whom she had known from an infant, whom she had seen grow up from a period when her notice was an honour, to have you now, in thoughtless spirits and in pride of the moment, laugh at her, humble her. This is not pleasant to you, Emma, and it is very far from pleasant to me. But I will tell you truths while I am satisfied with proving myself your friend by very faithful counsel, and trusting that you will some time or other do me greater justice than you can do me now. While they talked, they were advancing towards the carriage. It was ready, and before she could speak again, he had handed her in. He had misinterpreted the feeling which kept her face averted and her tongue motionless. Mr. Knightley's little sermon, in its old-fashioned English, is as applicable now as it was when it was spoken. We know that he was an especial favourite with Jane Austen. Part 4. Mr. Austen died at Bath, and his family removed to Southampton. In 1811, Mrs. Austen, her daughters, and her niece settled finally at Chawton, a house belonging to Jane's brother, Mr. Knight. He was adopted by an uncle, whose name he took, and from Chawton all her literary work was given to the world. Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, were already written, but in the next 5 years, from 35 to 40, she set to work seriously, and wrote Mansfield Park, Emma, and Persuasion. Anyone who has written a book will know what an amount of labour this represents. One can picture to oneself the little family scene which Jane describes to Cassandra. Pride and Prejudice just come down in a parcel from town, the unsuspicious Miss B. to dinner, and Jane and her mother setting to in the evening and reading aloud half the first volume of a new novel sent down by the brother. Unsuspicious Miss B. is delighted. Jane complains of her mother's too rapid way of getting on. Though she perfectly understands the characters herself, she cannot speak as they ought. Upon the whole, however, she says, I am quite vain enough and well satisfied enough. This is her own criticism of Pride and Prejudice. The work is rather too light and bright and sparkling. It wants shade. It wants to be stretched out here and there with a long chapter of sense, if it could be had, if not of solemn specious nonsense about something unconnected with the story. An essay on writing, a critique on Walter Scott, or the history of Bonaparte. And so Jane Austen lives quietly, working at her labour of love, interested in her own darling children's success, the light of the home, one of the real living children says afterwards, speaking in the days when she was no longer there. She goes to London once or twice. Once she lives for some months in Hans Place, nursing a brother through an illness. Here it was that she received some little compliments and messages from the Prince Regent, to whom she dedicated Emma. He thanks her and acknowledges the handsome volumes, and she laughs and tells her publisher that at all events his share of the offering is appreciated, whatever hers may be. We are also favoured with some valuable suggestions from Mr. Clarke, the Royal Librarian, respecting a very remarkable clergyman. He is anxious that Miss Austen should delineate one who should pass his time between the metropolis and the country, something like Beattie's minstrel, entirely engaged in literature and no man's enemy but his own. Failing to impress this character upon the authoress, he makes a fresh suggestion, and proposes that she should write a romance illustrative of the august house of Coburg. It would be interesting, he says, and very properly dedicated to Prince Leopold. To which the authoress replies, I could no more write a romance than an epic poem. I could not seriously sit down to write a romance under any other motive than to save my life. And if it were indispensable for me to keep it up, and never relax into laughing at myself or other people, I am sure I should be hung before the first chapter. There is a delightful collection of friends' suggestions which she has put together, but which is too long to be quoted here. She calls it Plan of a Novel, as suggested by various friends. All this time, while her fame is slowly growing, life passes in the same way as in the old cottage at Chawton. Aunt Jane, with her young face and her mob cap, makes playhouses for the children, helps them to dress up, invents imaginary conversations for them, supposing that they are all grown up, the day after a ball. One can imagine how delightful a game that must have seemed to the little girls. She built her nest, did this good woman, happily weaving it out of shreds and ends and scraps of daily duty patiently put together, and it was from this nest that she sang the song, bright and brilliant, with quaint thrills and unexpected cadences, that reaches us even here through near a century. The lesson her life seems to teach us is this: don't let us despise our nests. Life is as much made of minutes as of years. Let us complete the daily duties. Let us patiently gather the twigs and the little scraps of moss, of dried grass together, and see the result. A whole, completed and coherent, beautiful even without the song. We come too soon to the story of her death, and yet did it come too soon? A sweet life is not the sweeter for being long. Jane Austen lived years enough to fulfil her mission. She lived long enough to write 6 books that were masterpieces in their way, to make a world the happier for her industry. One cannot read the story of her latter days, of her patience, her sweetness and gratitude, without emotion. There is family trouble, we are not told of what nature. She falls ill. Her nieces find her in her dressing gown like an invalid in an armchair in her bedroom, but she gets up and greets them, and pointing to seats which had been arranged for them by the fire, says, "There is a chair for the married lady, and a little stool for you, Caroline." But she is too weak to talk, and Cassandra takes them away. At last they persuade her to go to Winchester, to a well-known doctor there. It distressed me, she says, in one of her last dying letters, to see Uncle Henry and William Knight, who kindly attended us, riding in the rain almost the whole way. We expect a visit from them tomorrow, and hope they will stay the night, and on Thursday, which is a confirmation and a holiday, we hope to get Charles out to breakfast. We have had but one visit from him, poor fellow, as he is in the sick room. God bless you, dear E. If ever you are ill, may you be as tenderly nursed as I have been. But nursing does not cure her, nor can the doctor save her to them all, and she sinks from day to day. To the end she is full of concern for others. As for my dearest sister, my tender, watchful, indefatigable nurse has not been made ill by her exertions, she writes. As to what I owe her, and the anxious affection of all my beloved family on this occasion, I can only cry over it, and pray God to bless them more and more. One can hardly read this last sentence with dry eyes. It is her parting blessing and farewell to those she had blessed all her life by her presence and her love, that love which is beyond death, and of which the benediction remains, not only spoken in words, but by the ever-present signs and the tokens of those lifetimes which do not end for us as long as we ourselves exist. They asked her when she was near her end if there was anything she wanted. Nothing but death, she said. Those were her last words. She died on the 18th of July, 1817, and was buried in Winchester Cathedral, where she lies not unremembered. End of Jane Austen, by Anne Thackeray Ritchie. Read by Noel Badrian.